Hello, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to our 13th annual CLGS Georgia Harkness lecture here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. My name is Bernie Schlager. I use pronouns he, they, and I serve as executive director at PSR Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. As we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge that we here at PSR and CLGS work on the sacred and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We are grateful for their faithful stewardship of this holy ground, which continues to support all we seek to accomplish in the name of justice, love, and compassion, as we pledge to work to build a world where all can thrive. Our lecturer this evening, as you know, is Professor Julia Watts Belser, who will be speaking on queer Crip revelation, disability dance, Jewish text, and the sacred potency of difference. Welcome, Professor Belser. We are honored by your presence with us here this evening. Before I introduce more fully Professor Belser, I would like first to welcome Reverend Dr. David Vasquez Levy, who serves as president here at Pacific School of Religion.
Thank you, Bernie, and great to be with you all. Welcome to this Harkness lecture at Pacific School of Religion. My name is David Vasquez Levy, as Bernie just indicated, and I serve as president at PSR. We are delighted this afternoon to welcome Professor Julia Watts Belser as our 2022 Harkness lecture speaker. Professor Belser's work, as you will hear more fully and experience, demonstrates the impact of scholarship and activism that draws across disciplinary boundaries and is deeply enriched by engaging a diversity of perspectives, including those of minoritized and marginalized communities. In this regard, she honors the remarkable legacy and pioneering work of George Harkness, whose name this lecture series honors, and it reflects PSR's own commitments to being unafraid. This time of pandemic, protest, and polarization calls for reflections that take seriously our bodies, identities, and interconnectedness to one another on our hurting planet. It is with that understanding that I am delighted to welcome Professor Belser on behalf of the broader PSR community. Welcome, and welcome to all of you as well.
Thank you so much, David. And now for a fuller introduction of our speaker, Julia Watts Belser, who uses pronouns she, her, is a rabbi, scholar, and spiritual teacher who works at the intersections of disability studies, queer feminist Jewish ethics, and environmental justice. She is professor of Jewish studies at Georgetown University, senior research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program. She is the author of several scholarly books, including most recently, Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. Her next book, Loving Our Own Bones, Disability, Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole, will be coming out in 2023 with Beacon Press. A longtime activist for disability and gender justice, Professor Belser currently directs an initiative on disability and climate change that aims to analyze and address the disproportionate impact that environmental risk and climate disruption have on disability communities. A powerful advocate for disability arts, she collaborates with internationally recognized queer and disabled artists in the United States and around the world. Her work brings queer disability arts and activism into conversation with Jewish culture and creates spaces for queer and disability communities to claim and celebrate our insights into the sacred. In this afternoon's lecture, Professor Belser will probe the embodied ethics and spiritual insights of Claire Cunningham's Thank You Very Much, a contemporary dance performance that brings queer disability culture into provocative conversation with the glittering world of Elvis tribute artists. Using disability dance to surface unexpected liberatory possibility within biblical and rabbinic Jewish texts, this lecture will bear witness to the violence arrayed against queer and disabled lives, and also claim the sacred potency of queer disability joy, illuminating the revelatory power of the choice to unfurl the brilliance of our embodied difference. And let me just say a few words about this annual CLGS Georgia Harkness lecture here at Pacific School of Religion. In the fall of 2010, CLGS inaugurated this lecture series, the second of the center's two named lectures. The Georgia Harkness lecture is presented each year in the month of October, and our CLGS Johnny Boswell lecture is offered every April. The Boswell lectureship was launched in 2008. As President David Vasquez Levy just mentioned, Professor Julia Harkness, who lived from 1891 to 1974, was a pioneering theologian in the Methodist tradition. She was also a leading figure in the ecumenical movement and the first woman hired to teach theology at a Christian seminary. Professor Harkness focused her teaching and writing in more than 30 books and countless articles on the practical application of theology to the pressing social issues of her day, ranging from women's rights to anti-racism, war and peace, international relations, and later in her life, full civil rights for lesbian and gay people. She retired from teaching after serving on the faculty here at Pacific School of Religion from 1949 to 1960. The passion that Professor Harkness brought to her work of making vital theological connections among wider cultural and political issues, her keen interest in employing poetry and other arts in her theological work, and her firm commitment to civil rights and social justice. All of this has contributed significantly to PSR's long tradition of living, serving, and being unafraid since our founding in 1866. It is a tradition that shapes the ongoing work of PSR's Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, and we were founded in 2000. I would like to mention that this 13th annual CLGS Georgia Harkness Lecture is being co-sponsored, and we are thankful for the co-sponsorship of Congregation Shahar Zahav, a Reform synagogue in San Francisco, California, and by our own CLGS Jewish Roundtable. And very, very finally, some housekeeping details. Our captioner for today's lecture is Corvin Corridosti. Welcome, Corvin, and thank you. We are grateful for your support this evening. This event is being live streamed on Facebook and recorded for later viewing on our various social media sites. Any questions you have for Professor Belser, please use the Q&A feature here in the Zoom webinar format. And the lecture, of course, will conclude with the period of discussion and Q&A with our lecturer. So thank you for listening to these long introductory comments. And once again, I welcome Professor Julia Watts Belser.
Thank you so much, Bernie, David. It is such an honor to offer the Georgia Harkness Lecture and to center and celebrate the brilliance, the fire, the subversive spiritual dissidence of queer and disabled folks, to claim our lives as sacred. I speak today at the intersection of several worlds. I am a scholar, a cultural historian of rabbinic Jewish literature. I study representations of disability in classical Jewish text, parsing the cultural functions of what I like to call dissident bodies, bodies and minds that won't quite stay in line. I am an activist, committed to naming and transforming deep patterns of social and structural violence, especially the harm that religious texts and traditions have done to disabled people, to women and non-binary folk, to people of color, to trans and queer folk, to so many of us whose bodies and minds have been marked as other, as different, or as less. And I am a rabbi, committed to teaching a Torah of love and liberation, a Torah rooted in the wisdom of queer, feminist, disability communities. In my talk today, I'll bring Jewish texts into dialogue with queer disability arts to show how queer disability dance can be a potent site for spiritual and political insight. I'll use provocative juxtapositions between the secular and the sacred to probe the religious idea of revelation, to draw out how revelation operates, to illuminate its political, interpersonal, and personal charge, and to unfold its queer, disabled power. We'll dive together into Claire Cunningham's Thank You Very Much, a contemporary dance performance that brings queer disability culture into provocative conversation with the world of Elvis tribute artists. Claire Cunningham is a celebrated Scottish choreographer and artist, a queer disabled dancer whose artistic work involves creative use and misuse of her own crutches. Her work is daring, subversive, unexpected, and political. Her performances ask viewers to radically rethink conventional assumptions about beauty and bodies and belonging. I'd like to show you now a 1-minute trailer just to give you a first glimpse of Thank You Very Much, the performance we'll be talking about today. The trailer is a montage of different scenes from the performance. The video begins with a close shot of Claire Cunningham, a small silver-haired person with wearing a black leather jacket and a shock of silver hair, doing a sensuous, slow bend with her crutches. The stage is lit up from beneath. Squares of brilliant white light illuminate in time with her movements and the music. And when the scene shifts, we'll get glimpses of other moments in the performance. The legs of 2 dancers as they follow carefully along a thin taped line. A queer disabled man with his back toward us, looking into a mirror, making final adjustments to a gold lame jacket. A tall white woman slowly donning sunglasses. A sassy, sultry woman in red, kneeling before a dressing cabinet, lifting her crossed crutches high over her head. We'll see these dancers in motion, wheels, crutches, bodies, dancing together and apart. So I'll take a moment to share my screen and let you view this trailer, performance trailer.
What does it mean to try and learn to move like someone else?
When you put the costume on, it gets you in the zone, if you like.
I'm the person who brought all these troublemakers together.
I love the fact I get to dress up as somebody else.
Thank you very much.
All right. So the question Cunningham asks hangs at the heart of this piece. What does it mean to try and learn to move like someone else? It's a question that has haunted so many disabled people through years of training, often fruitless, often futile, to hold ourselves a certain way, to school our bodies to a particular kind of behavior, to root out our distinctive movements, to hide the tremor, the spasm, the lisp, the limp, to align ourselves with a non-disabled norm. Disabled people aren't the only ones who know this. It's something so many minoritized people learn. I think of the way so many queer folk know the fear of flaming, the way we've learned to tamp down difference. Trans kin especially know the risks, the price of breaking society's gender mold. I want to hold this moment, to hold in memory those who have been murdered, those who have been lost. Cunningham's performance acknowledges this violence. At several points, thank you very much gives voice to the cost that normativity exacts, the pain, the violence that is inseparable from the relentless push toward conformity, that push to be just like everybody else. But Cunningham also allows us to glimpse the transgressive, redemptive potential that lives just a breath away. The way the very same skills that queer and disabled folks have used to try and train our bodies to compliance can also become the ground and the architecture of our own queer Crip revelation. During Thank You Very Much, during the making of Thank You Very Much, each of the professional disabled dancers who are a part of Cunningham's ensemble paired up with an Elvis tribute artist. In public parlance, we often call them Elvis impersonators. But that name, impersonator, is a name that most artists dislike. Consider the valence of the words. The way to impersonate summons up a sense of trickery, of fakery, while tribute is an act of homage, an honor. During the months of research as they were making the show, Cunningham's dancers each worked with a tribute artist, training, investigating, listening, learning their moves, learning how the Elvis tribute artists approached the art of embodying an icon. And during the performance itself, the recorded voices of those tribute artists form a central part of the script in provocative interplay with the dancers. I'd like to play for you now the first 2 minutes of Thank You Very Much. Just a description at first to orient us. The performance will open with Cunningham alone in an utterly dark performance space. As the piece begins, the only light comes from a small, square, elevated stage, illuminated from beneath, so that her feet, her face, and her crutches glow. Cunningham moves slowly and deliberately, lifting her heels in rhythm to the pulse of the movement. Then we'll hear the voice of Lee Crow, an American Elvis tribute artist, giving Claire instructions, explaining how she holds her body, how she brings the physicality of Elvis to life in her own body, in her own bones. So just share my screen here.
The eyes are lazy. They're relaxed, right? You know, and they're from underneath a bit, right? From underneath, so that you get, you know, the bad boy stare. Oh, I'm bad. A lot of it is being on the ball of a foot. And you bring the knee in. This heel goes up, then this shoulder can come over, this whole hip. Yeah, foot up and that shoulder back. And then that can just be switched to the other side. And that is a classic, is simple as lifting one foot up, one heel up.
So Cunningham's scene showcases for me a provocative, unexpected kinship. That Elvis, the one who caught the world on fire, that American icon of utter self-assurance, moves in ways that evoke a disabled body's repertoire. The first gestures Cunningham makes on that darkened stage, that repetitive lift of heel onto toe, lit up to a striking beat with an audience waiting to see what unfolds. It's an evocative movement, a dance, an invitation. But set elsewhere, in the stark fluorescent lights of a doctor's office, under a cool, evaluative medical gaze, it's an exercise, a physical therapy task. It's just one more way of failing. The juxtaposition tantalizes. Cunningham revalues disabled movement, the spasm, the tremor, the jut of one hip, the twist of a foot, as the movement that could belong, that did belong, to the one the world called the king. The beauty of that, the strangeness, the sultry swagger, the sexuality, the desire it evoked, it's ours, she says, or it could be. It's something we know intimately. But Cunningham's making isn't simply an act of aspiring to be. It's a claiming of possibility, an unabashed embrace of provocative, queer, disabled beauty. There's a moment in the performance just after that first clip I showed when Lee Crow, the Elvis tribute artist, speaks in gendered terms about the swagger. She says, "The thing about portraying a man is that you can go out on stage and demand that people pay attention to you without any apologies." The gender politics here are tantalizing. Right? In the scene we just watched, Cunningham is wearing a black leather jacket. She's a slight, slender person embodying an aesthetic that reads as unabashedly butch. That demand that Crow speaks of, it's part of what makes the work catch fire. We know we're supposed to look. We're caught by that demand. But let me tell you a different disability story, a different story about looking This is an ancient Jewish story from the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 53b, tells a story about a certain man who married a woman whose hand was a stump. But he was not aware of it until the day that she died. That story in the Talmud is told as one of a series of surprising events. It's like a set of wondrous happenings that run counter to the expected order of things. The rabbis of the Talmud basically, they marvel that the woman's disability passes unnoticed, even in the intimate context of her marriage. And so immediately after they tell that story, two rabbis discuss its significance. They're trying to decide which party to praise. Is it the woman for being so modest that even her husband never knew the shape of her hand or the fact of its absence? Right? One rabbi suggests it's so, but the other isn't impressed. He says, look, such is a woman's way. Instead, he praises the exemplary piety of the husband, who never once pried into his wife's secrets, who wasn't interested in the nature of her body. Rabbi Chia, that rabbi, thinks it's natural for a woman to hide her stump, to conceal her quote unquote imperfection, to shield from view anything that someone else might regard as a blemish. In Chia's telling, it's the husband who becomes the hero of our tale, because he doesn't pore over his wife's body. He doesn't spend his days looking for ways that it doesn't measure up. Here, of course, I'm thinking about the ways in which the rabbis inhabit a world that is quite like our own, a world where men routinely pass their eyes over women's bodies, a world where men routinely have the power and privilege to assess and to judge. This woman's husband refuses that calculating gaze. He fails to notice her flaw. Now, whenever I tell this story, folks are quick to celebrate this man and this couple. Right? Finally, they say, we meet a man who values and cherishes his wife regardless of her disability. But friends, I want to tell you true. I hate this story. It is an absolute shaft to my own heart. Why? Because it champions the invisibility of disability. It valorizes a practice of looking past disability, something that still has a powerful hold on our culture today. Many of us, I suspect, have been trained to not see disability, to ignore impairment, to look past blemishes. Conventional codes of politeness drilled into us by anxious parents, teachers, and friends have taught so many of us to avert our eyes, to notice nothing, to not look. For me, this practice of ignoring disability registers as a tremendous loss. When I think about this story, I think about the silence that swallows up capacity for knowledge and for intimacy. How many years was that couple married, and he never knew the contours of her arm, the nuance of her skin? I want a different world for us. I want a world in which we come to see the particulars of our bodies as a means of coming into deeper knowledge, of coming to know one another in a deeper, truer, more intimate way. I want a world in which we are not afraid to unfold imperfection, in which we are able to recognize particularity and difference as a potent, essential dimension of who and how we are. That's the first dimension of revelation that I want to name and claim. the revelation that runs between us, the sacred art of saying to one another, perceive me, know me, understand who I am. In his powerful book, Radical Love, queer Christian theologian Patrick Chen argues that the doctrine of revelation can be understood as God's coming out, God's choice to be radically known. Revelation, Chen says, is like a love letter, an invitation to intimacy. God is not some abstract mystery, but a presence here, known, wanting, yearning. As with God's coming out, so too the queer human act of coming out is a gift. So too the revelation of disability can be a choice to share charged, secret knowledge, a choice to take a risk, to allow oneself to be known. Part of why revelation matters religiously is that it shocks us out of the known. By jolting us out of the conventional, by shaking our expectations, it opens up a space for wonder, a space that can be numinous, brilliant, and breathtaking. There's awe here, awe and wonder, maybe desire, maybe fear. The Elvis tribute artist Lee Crow says of Elvis, he was like nothing people had ever seen before. When that happens religiously in our bodies, in our bones, when we're arrested by a sight, by a possibility by something we couldn't imagine before, this is part of what disability dance brings into the world. It's part of why I love the work of disabled artists. So, because of the way it brings about such a powerful reconfiguration of our sense of the possible. I want to show you another short clip. It's a clip of two dancers, Claire Cunningham and Tanya Earhart, both on crutches as they face off at the corners of the small lit stage. The two dancers are dressed in flamboyant, fringed costumes, one white with a broad turquoise belt, the other red with accents of gold. They're leaning slightly toward each other, and as the music starts, you can feel the strength of their gaze, the intimacy and the intensity between them. For several moments, their bodies will be completely still, and then they begin to move in slow, intricate parallel, one crutch mirroring the other, one foot lifting, pivoting, circling the stage, eyes always on each other. So I'll take a moment now to show you a minute-long clip from the performance.
I think he seemed like nothing they'd ever seen before. They had never seen anybody look like that on TV, in real life, ever. He seemed like a space creature. Coming into your living room, and he scared a bunch of parents and turned on a bunch of kids. People had real visceral reactions to him. I've heard people's stories about how they saw it and what their first impression was, and it was just like mind-blowing. he seemed like a space creature.
So one of the things that always catches me with this piece is the way that Cunningham has choreographed the work to showcase both the beauty and the strangeness of the dancer's movement on crutches. I find it an uncanny piece, made all the more so by Crow's voiceover that accentuates the edginess, the alienness, and the sensual eroticism of the dance. When the music speeds, when bodies and crutches shadow each other and intertwine, Earhart and Cunningham move in ways that dancers who dance on feet alone could never match and could never mirror. We catch a glimpse, a glimmer of the power, the promise that disability brings into the world, a sense of the shiver, the wonder, the fierce and luminous beauty. So far, I've been naming revelation here in the key of boldness, using queer disability dance to illuminate what happens when we allow ourselves to say a radical yes to our difference, when we embrace what the groundbreaking disability justice performance troupe Sins Invalid calls an unshamed claim to beauty. But there's another way revelation opens for me, something I'd like to explore through dancer Vicki Malin's solo. It's a score where Malin speaks directly to the audience, while she offers us an intimate and intricate view of her own right hand, a hand whose motions and capacities are affected and shaped by her disability. Quite often, Malin says, what's going on in my body is very small, detailed, or maybe even completely unseen. Going unseen has come at a price for Malin, as it does for so many disabled people. While our culture tends to lift up visible physical disability as the quintessential icon of disablement, most disability experiences are not apparent at first glance. We often call this invisible disability, though that's a name that seems to me to veil the way that visibility is often also about how we listen, how we perceive. It's not a static quality, a property of certain bodies. Malin illuminates the burden that disclosure carries, the effort she and so many others extend to make her disability legible, the weight of the pervasive cultural assumption that all bodies and minds are non-disabled unless obviously marked as different. The pain and the frustration of other people's repeated disbelief. Sometimes, Malin tells the audience, she finds herself making small movements big in order to get what she needs, to fit expectations, to become believable. Disability disclosure, Malin shows, can be a revelation of another kind, an invitation to intimacy. One of the most arresting elements of Malin's work is the way she centers our attention on the small, on the almost imperceptible. In the intimacy of the theater's small stage, with audiences sitting only a breath away, Malin tells her story fresh each night. Her task, as she understands it, is to speak, to really speak to the people who are sitting by that stage, not to recite lines, not to rattle off a preset story, but to offer them the gift of actual presence. I think back to the Talmud story of the woman with a disabled hand, a story we might describe as revelation refused. Malin's offering is instead one of intimacy offered. The revelation of disability embrace. The revelation of what can blossom within us and between us when we turn toward rather than hide. While Malin works her hand, while she unfurls her fingers, she sings a cappella without a mic, gentle lines from Elvis's 1972 hit, "You Were Always on My Mind." Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have. Maybe I didn't love you quite as often as I could have. Ever since I sat stage side and watched the intricacy of Malin's work, ever since I've listened to her singing to her own hand, I've been nursing a question, a theological question. It's a question about God's hands. The Torah, the Bible, speaks over and over again about God's mighty right hand. The psalmist repeats this refrain over and over. Exodus 2 extols the power, the strength, the glory of God's yamincha, God's right hand. But I'm not interested in that hand, not the strong hand, not the confident hand. I want to think with you about the other one, God's left. It's a hand that's never celebrated. It's a hand that's never praised. And that silence makes me wonder about weakness. That silence feels like the shutter that's drawn around disability, the pact that buries down into so many of our bones. Keep it covered, keep it out of sight. Don't let them notice. There's a long, robust tradition among both Jewish and Christian theological interpreters that posits God as a being who is without flaw. This tradition imagines God as impervious, God as untouchable, God as utter, absolute perfection. That's actually one of the reasons that the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides found the idea of God having a body to be so repugnant, because bodies change, bodies perish, bodies are frail, bodies can't ever or always be perfect. It's not in their nature. But here's the thing. For me, I find perfection boring. The God I long for, the God who rustles in my soul like crackling leaves on the cusp of winter, is a God who has given her heart again and again. A God who's gotten scuffed up by the centuries. A God whose joints ache when the rain comes. A God whose bones creak when the seasons turn. Now, truth be told, I don't really think of God as having a body like you or I do. But I use my own body knowledge, my own queer, disabled body knowledge as a way to think and feel my way toward God, as a doorway, as a ground that opens to the infinite. Disability studies theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson once described disability as the experience of flesh as it encounters world. That's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to imagining God as a God who knows disability intimately from the inside. Because I associate disability with the pulse of life itself, with investment in life as it is, not some pretty sterile illusion of a distant, disinterested perfection. Now, I don't presume to know the first thing about how God feels about God's own left hand. But I know how that all-encompassing silence that surrounds God's left has left its mark in our own collective human consciousness. There's a deep association in certain Christian circles that fashions the left as the devil's space, a notion that has a long and terrible history of left-handed children beaten, abused, with their hands restrained. And certain Jewish Kabbalistic traditions develop a similar motif, that notion of the left as the side and site of severe judgment, or in some other tellings, as a site of evil. If there's one overriding instinct that queer and disability experience has given me as an interpreter, it is a bone-deep suspicion of these kind of pronouncements. Queerness and disability have both long been associated with the monstrous, with the despised. My own queer Crip feminist politics makes me want to turn toward all those ways in which our bodies have been named as nasty, as wicked, as undesirable. It makes me want to refuse those bitter, brittle lies. This isn't simply about the bad side. I think of all the ways we speak about our bodies, whether we're disabled or not. The way dominant culture teaches us to disown our aches, to deny our illnesses, to push away those places where our bodies are weak or tender. The bum knee, the bad hip. What would it be like to sing to them? Maybe I never loved you. This is part of the cultural work that queer and disability communities do. The way we upend conventional notions of normativity, the way we crack the chrysalis of shame and silence, the way we teach ourselves to honor the complexities of our actual bodies and minds. I name this as sacred work. This work of claiming each other's lives as brash and beautiful and beloved in a world that all too often treats us as nothing more than trash. I name as sacred the long, slow work of saying yes to ourselves as we are in this moment, the intricate work of loving our own sweet, aching bones. With that in mind, I want to close my talk tonight by sharing one final video glimpse. A 2019 teaser from Thank You Very Much when it opened at the prestigious Manchester International Festival. The video offers a montage of beautifully blurred photos of the dancers moving through different paces. The camera hones in on close-ups of the dancers' bodies. Two hands pressed one over the other, fingers curling over the handle of a crutch, a foot, the toes a bit splayed, moving carefully and deliberately, one step and then another. I'll play the trailer now.
They're looking at you and they're watching your every move. He walks on tall and he walks deliberately. And they're watching your every move, and every move you do gets a reaction as well. And so when you come on the stage, you know, they're looking at you because, you know, you're a piece of perfection.
The voice you heard there belongs to Des, an Elvis tribute artist, describing what it's like on stage, the energy, the reality, the intensity of the audience's desire. They're looking at you, Des says, and they're watching your every move. It's a moment disabled folks, queer folks, trans folks, so many of us know all too well what it's like to be watched, to be the subject of everyone else's stares. But it's different, isn't it? It's different when Des tells this story. And thank you very much. We hear these words first during a score with queer disabled artist Dan Daw, while he's walking painstakingly, deliberately along a taped line. It's a riff off a familiar exercise, a physical therapy routine, one of those 1,000 ordinary moments when disabled kids learn how close the world is watching our every move. But the image of Daw that you saw in that trailer, it's from his brilliant final solo when he spins out center stage wearing nothing but black boxers, black tennis shoes, and a jacket made of gold lame. He walks on tall, his movements bold and fearless. There's a sachet here, an absolute delight in queerness and in disability. His steps are high and light. He's on his toes, an artistry accentuated by the particulars of disability, the kind of movement I know, because it's part of what my body knows. A particular curve of the wrist, a curl of the hand, a turn of the leg. It is flat out fabulous. It's beautiful. It's sensuous and slow, and every eye is right on him. What might have been a moment for scrutinizing impairment becomes an invitation to see the absolute wonder of the body as it is. It's a different kind of watching now, a different kind of revelation. That the thing that other folks despise might be our treasure. That the thing they told us was our flaw might be our brilliance and our beauty. That the thing we thought we had to hide might be the best beloved. You're a piece of perfection. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Belser. We will now open the room to questions. Folks, please use the Q&A box and send us your questions. One question was, about playing the video of the hand, and you're responding, Professor Belser.
Yeah, no video of the hand. You get instead a little cameo of me singing, singing a little snatch of Elvis. To get the real deal, I recommend, if you ever have the opportunity to catch the performance when it goes on tour, it's extraordinary. Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. Beautiful. And so I'd love to hear folks' thoughts. You're welcome to ask questions, but you're also warmly welcome to share thoughts or reactions or something that lands with you. So don't feel that you must form your comments in a question. It's a bit of a joke in academic circles. We say, make sure there's a question in that comment. But in this case, actually, I really warmly welcome anything you'd like to offer, including thoughts or reactions. Thank you.
I will begin if okay, and it's not a question, it's a reaction. As you were talking about, this Talmud story of revelation refused, and in your beautiful description of the particularity of our bodies and revelation as the sacred art of saying, perceiving, knowing, and loving, what came to my mind were two. They're more than comments, but things that I remember reading or seeing in documentaries, something very similar that Harvey Milk had said in Audre Lorde, and that was in their activism. So this comment reflection, which is a little messy in putting it together, is connecting the sacred texts and the potency of our difference with how we are in the world. And in any event, both Harvey Milk and Audre Lorde said that they came to this moment in their own lives of activism where they had thought that if, and speaking in the first person, if I dress and act and pretend that I'm feminine or straight or masculine, I will be accepted. And change can be possible that way. And each of them said they came to this moment of realizing that's not how it works, that I can't pretend. And by pretending, I kind of highlight my queerness and my difference. So it's just a reflection. Your words brought that memory to mind because there is this revelatory power in our queerness or disability. And so that was just something that came to my mind.
Thank you so much. It's such a beautiful and thoughtful and important reflection. And I think as I'm thinking about what you're sharing, I'm struck by, of course, the first thing I want to affirm is that we all always make strategic choices about how much to share, how close to the bone, right? We want, and that's, so I don't want to lift up the idea of coming out, of doing this kind of revelatory work as the only way one can do provocative work in the world. I feel actually that it's so urgent to recognize that there are many paths, to navigating our lives and to navigating a often hostile world. And so there's a part of me that wants to say, whatever gets us through the day and night, go with it, right? Go with it. But because there's such a cultural pressure that so many of us face and so many of us internalize to tamp it down, to play it quiet, to play it straight. That's where it feels so important to lift up the provocative power of saying no to that. And that's, I think, a space where, I feel that this is a space where there's such an important resonant kinship between queer and trans and disability experiences. And of course, these are overlapping categories, right? But it's one place where I really feel there's such charged, powerful potential for these overlapping communities to recognize and kind of revel in some deep kinships.
Thank you. And then if it's all right with you, Julia, I'll read through some of these and then see if you want to react to them or what, is that okay? Or would you like to?
Sure, that's fine. I also have them up on screen and I don't
Okay.
mind just responding. Yeah. So,
Okay, whatever is easier for you to do.
Great, beautiful. So just really moved by the comments that are coming in, appreciating, Cedar, your words about how much the talk meant to you as a queer disabled Jew in progress. And I want to say thank you. And also, you mentioned specifically, right, the significance of God's left hand. And yeah, for me, that was such a, I remember distinctively the moment when I was in Edinburgh. I had the chance to, actually I was in Glasgow, sorry, I was in Glasgow, I had the chance to watch the performance several nights running. And I remember in the middle of one of those performances while Vicki Malin was just doing this gorgeous work, and I was kind of watching the play of the shadow puppetry, actually, of her hand lit up in the stage lights. And that moment of thinking about, right, what if, I guess I always go there as a quirky theologian, I always go there and I think, what if God knows disability from the inside, right? And that recognizing that silence, that first of all, the overemphasis, right? The like doubling down on this idea of the mighty right hand, and then the complete silence of this other hand. It felt to me actually like an antidote in some ways, like a little piece of treasure that I could hold alongside that other gross story that I told from the Talmud about the woman who didn't get to share, right, the truth of her own hand, even with her own husband. So really also appreciating, Linda, your comments about appreciating the idea of being perfect and in one's own body, and recognizing that our difference is our gift, whether that's physical difference, whether that's the difference of being queer. Yeah, that sense of turning it around, of closing the not buying into that notion that we should accept at face value the dominant conception of disability, of queerness, of a thousand other ways of being in the world as like somehow broken or flawed or second best. I think a lot of my work comes from an impulse to want to help us muster the internal capacity to say yes to ourselves, even if we never do that publicly. So Patricia, really appreciating your invitation and desire to learn more about the work of disabled performers. There's such gorgeous disability arts and such powerful disability arts work happening in the world. would just kind of commend you to check out the work of the performers that I've mentioned here today, as well as, dive into the world of Sins Invalid and artists like Alice Shepard and Jerome Herman, and just brilliant disabled artists redefining and reimagining the possibilities. Okay. So just taking a moment here to look at some other questions, actually, maybe thinking about, okay, great. Actually, Bernie, if I can ask you to pick up a couple of questions now for me, so I get a moment to gather my thoughts, that would be super.
Sure. Let me scan through. So I won't read the comments necessarily, which are beautiful. I'm writing, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Ben is writing as a rabbinical student, wondering about conceptualizing how we might center God that is reflective of embodied disability in ways that make sense to our communities. What is coming to mind for me is conceptualizing Shabbat as God's embodied need for rest because God's body aches after the sacred work of creating as the disabled body.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, resonant insight, Ben. Shabbat has been very important to me as a way of claiming rest as a part of the sacred rhythm of creation, and as a it feels in many ways like we might be able to use it as an antidote to at least some aspects of rampant productivity culture, which is one of the ways that ableism operates, right? Faster, faster, more. If you're too slow, if you're not good enough. And so one of the things that maybe I'll just mention, I have a book coming out next year, which in which I talk about that more. And so if you're I'll drop, when I have a moment, I'll drop my website in the chat if you want to sign up for updates about that. I'd be delighted to share that with you. Alas, it's not quite hot off the presses yet, but in 2023, more on Shabbat coming soon. But I absolutely agree, Ben. I think it's an extraordinarily resonant potential for inviting Jewish communities and perhaps perhaps other communities, Christian communities that tap into Sabbath as well, might find their own ways and rhythms for thinking about what it means to recognize rest and rest times as an integrated part of the work of creation, something that God self needs.
And then an anonymous attendee, moved by what you shared with us, wondering how we can spread the message you shared with us in our communities and communities that seem to be incapable of awareness of otherness and of inclusion.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. I feel like this is ongoing work. And when a couple things come to mind, I feel like there's some really extraordinary work being done right now by disabled clergy, spiritual teachers, and I know of a lot of folks who are doing this work in Jewish and Christian communities, as well as in other religious communities as well. And I would encourage you to find ways to bring some of those folks, to invite some of those folks to be guest scholars, teachers, preachers in your community. Another option is to, I'd love to see more religious communities do book clubs, reading work that centers the work of disability activists. There's some powerful memoir, cultural work happening, and sometimes gathering together to read the work of luminous writers like Eli Clare, like Riva Lair, Leah Lakshmi, Pyapsna Samarasinghe. There's don't always think you need to look for or wait for someone to write specifically about religious stuff. I think it's so important. One of the things I try to model in this talk is how important it can be for religious communities to invest and to recognize the sacredness of secular queer disability cultural work, right? Not to like claim it as sacred in some appropriative way, right? But to recognize the powerful work that's happening here as something that religious communities can and should and must learn from humbly.
And then from, thank you, from Jane, Jewish textual issues with disability, in quotes, are troubling since revelation is ongoing through interpretation and midrash, creative narrative. How do we imagine, how do we create an ongoing revelation which is inclusive and holy?
Yeah, such a beautiful, beautiful question. I would just here really lift up the liberative power, the holy power of disability midrash, of the work that one of my passions, one of my hopes is to create more space for more queer and disabled and other minoritized and marginalized communities to be doing the work of interpreting for ourselves. And as you noticed in this talk, part of that for me is also just saying no to certain things, right? I feel like in my own life as an interpreter, part of my work is finding aspects of tradition that I can wholeheartedly embrace. And then there is also an important, urgent task of saying the great holy nope to certain things that I think are just not the work of liberation. And so that twin commitment to saying yes and saying no, that's powerful to me.
Thank you. And Annabeth is offering so much gratitude. We'll be carrying your words deep in their sometimes creaky bones.
Oh, yes, creaky bones unite.
And Dr. Susan Abraham is thanking you so much, Professor Belser. Great presentation. I have fond memories of your conversations at HDS many moons ago.
Susan, thank you. Beautiful that you're here. I'd love to pick up Riva Lair's question. Can you speak to the gender differences between how disabilities are described in Jewish texts? It's a marvelous question. And one of the things, so it's always difficult to do this on one foot, or since I'm a wheelchair user, I like to say on one wheel. But broad brush, I'll point to one thing that is really striking to me. Women's disability in the Babylonian Talmud is almost always conceptualized in terms of visual bodily blemish. Right? It is often strongly associated with a failure to please the male gaze. Male disability is more complex and multifaceted. There's actually a lot of discussion of male disability in the context of priestly blemishes. I have written about both of these topics. And so if you're interested in reading more, you can check out some material that's on my website. I have two scholarly, but hopefully still reasonably accessible pieces available there that I've made available open access. But here's a great thing when it comes to thinking about in the context of Jewish marriage law, when the rabbis talk about, right? So I said women's disability are often visual and associated with failures to please the eye. The rabbis often conceptualize the husband's most unfortunate blemishes as a matter that fails to please the woman's nose. So there's some really interesting, right? If he's stinky, that's many of the disabilities are there, particularly emerge. Sometimes they're about bodily weakness or other kinds of occupational hazards and disabilities. But there's a whole set that are also what we might, right, imagine as a different kind of revulsion. So really interesting to just think about the way that at different cultural moments we conceptualize what makes certain kinds of disabilities particularly difficult and particularly hard to embrace. I'm always interested in shaking that up and challenging that.
And just to name, we're getting multiple compliments on the captioning. And so,
absolutely, I'd like to echo that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Corbin. Done so well. And then let's see, beautiful comment from Adrian. Possibly the most emotionally impactful talk I've ever witnessed. I felt so held, so loved. I'm unlearning so much internalized ableism, working on learning and fostering queer, trans, disabled joy and care. I'm being unapologetically queer and disabled in my community and in the world as much as I can be from my bed, taking up that space, not hiding. I can't think of a question, but thank you for this.
Thank
you made me
thank
cry
you.
in the best way.
Thank
And truly
you,
the
so
best
beautiful.
captions I've ever seen.
Yes.
Grace writes, it was a liberating experience to listen to the sensuality of your description and to watch the images. I was given permission to study the power of the movements rather than the, in quotes, limitations. I wonder how it would feel to be in an audience of persons reacting on many levels.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question, Grace. And of course, I can only speak about that from my own experiences. I've had the privilege of being in the live audience at a number of Claire Cunningham's performances. And one of the things that's so striking to me is the way that Cunningham is an artist who takes, in my experience, exquisite care of her audiences and really is so generous and like loving toward the audience. So there's a lot of, even though there's aspects of the performance work that I think can be quite, in some ways, startling or different, as you mentioned in your comment, right? You're kind of given permission to look at things that in other contexts, it's maybe not entirely clear we are supposed to, quote unquote, be looking at, but there's this extraordinary like care and attention to wanting to, I guess I would say, sort of hold and support the audience so they can be present. And that's, it's really moving to me. I think the other piece that is for me so moving as a disabled person is that I feel warmly welcomed into the space as I am, right? So rather than many conventional theater spaces, as a wheelchair user, I'm often like locked into a particular spot or sort of left kind of hanging out in the aisle. And so there's also so many ways in which being in a crowd that is, and in a community, in a space that's so disability friendly through and through, is also a transformative experience. It makes me feel a little bit like what, right, like Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samara Singha says that disability performance sometimes gives us a little taste, right, of the world that we're imagining. I always Jewishly think it's like a taste of the world to come.
Just to answer one question about the recording of the talk, we will post it on our website within 48 hours. So thank you for that.
Beautiful. And I'm dropping the, a couple of people asked about materials or if you wanted to sign up. So that's a link to my website. You're warmly welcome to sign up on the like super occasional update list or to check out other materials that are there.
And this is from Jane. Thank you, Julia. Professor Belser, this was so beautiful and profound. I don't yet have the words yet for naming how this spoke to me personally. I do have a question about race. I've heard, including very recently, from Black friends and colleagues, that Elvis made acceptable and visible ways of being bodily that were previously not centered because they were Black African-American ways of being, and thus that he became centered because he was white. Any expression or conversation on this among the dancers and choreographers and in your own work?
Jane, such a important and powerful comment. Thank you for lifting that up. It's actually, there's a really significant segment on this where Tanya Earhart, the dancer who you had the chance to see dancing opposite Cunningham in red, does a whole an extraordinary talk in the middle of the performance, laying some of that out and critiquing the way in which that works, some of the racial politics, the questions around appropriation, the way in which the Elvis was able to maybe at least eventually normalize and make acceptable mainstream something that was ways of moving and singing and being that that belonged to and emerged out of Black and African American communities. So that is a really significant dimension of the work. Thanks for raising it here too.
And folks who are sharing resources in the Q&A, we had some trouble with the chat, but it should be working now, so you can share with everyone in the chat.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, so apologize for that glitch there. We're coming to the end of our time. There are many more in there, mostly comments. Riva asks are the Christian texts more focused on miraculous healing, or is it parallel?
So again, right on one wheel, of course, the nuances need more attention than I can give in just a brief response. But yes, I think it's fair to say that there's more attention in particularly the Christian New Testament on the motif of the healing of disability and more emphasis on kind of curative questions. That's largely because of the significant way in which Jesus's ministry was sort of understood was like showcased in relation to disabled people and the experience of cure, that there's been a lot of conversation and discussion and quite a bit of pushback from disability communities, including from some Christian disabled folks, about those stories, some very important work about how sometimes that focus on cure and healing can double down on this idea of disability as something that requires a fix, right? As well as some of the ways in which these stories can objectify and further marginalize disabled people, even when that isn't the intent of the healing or the telling. Jewish tradition has a few, right? Occasionally we do get some motifs around healing, but I'd say it's less of a significant motif. Jewish texts get difficult about disability in other ways. So in my experience, there's plenty of difficulty in ancient texts to go around.
Maybe we could take just a few more. So this is from our friend Eli, a thought on leftness. Before the invention of toilet paper, globally people were expected to eat with their right hand and wipe themselves with their left. This way, one could always tell that everyone was using their clean hand in touching food and other people. This is, to me, behind the silence around God's left hand. Left hands were considered dirty all around the world. Wonder how you hear this. Thank you for an amazing talk.
Yeah, such an amazing comment. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm just thinking about how this sort of this historical, sociological, anthropological detail gives us some insight into the way in which religious ritual and practice and way of being in the world is often rooted in a particular sociocultural need. And then it takes on a huge life that lives far beyond that moment. So I think that's just a great example of how this moment of kind of historical context can give us a glimpse into perhaps some of the earliest reasons or thinking that might have shaped some of these ideas. And yet it also feels like I want to really name and recognize the larger life that practice has built, right? And I think there's a part of me that has been trained up as a queer, as a feminist, as a disabled interpreter to say, I always want to look more closely at what has been marked as dirty, as undesirable, as fit only for the discards, for the trash, okay? And say, I just want to recognize that that might be wrong.
So two more, if I might, unless Julia, you want to circle on any. One is from Marcy, fabulous talk. Thank you. There are so many folks in my life with whom I would like to share your words once the recording is available. My comment, it will be within 2 days. Back to Marcy's comment, I want to say, see, this is what is possible in the intersections. I can't think of a good question at the moment. And then Crystal says, thank you for this education. I recently saw a sign language interpreter doing interpretive dance for music translation from auditory to kinetic visual sensory input. Is there any intersection in this type of dancing and other possible modalities?
So the work that sign language interpreters do is different from the work of, thank you, this is such a great question. The work that sign language interpreters do is different from the work that is being done by disabled dancers and artists in their own right. And I wouldn't want to conflate those two. Okay? And then there's a whole other related genre of deaf arts and deaf dance that's worth recognizing as a sort of third stream. But when we think about potential intersection, it's really quite wonderful to watch disability artists collaborate and work with sign language interpreters. We often see some really thoughtful, careful collaborations emerging because so many disabled artists are thinking really deeply about access and cross-disability access. I think that we're seeing that with regard to sign language interpreters. We're seeing that also with audio description. So that's providing an account for those who are blind or visually impaired or otherwise not able to access the visual content of what is happening, a verbal account of what is happening on stage, an extraordinary amount of creativity unfolding these days in disability arts about how to do multimodal access in practice. And that's, to my mind, just a really, really beautiful thing. We saw a little bit of that tonight. Thank you so much, Corbin, for the extraordinary captioning that you have been doing for us, including your exquisite attention to not just the words, but also the music and the full experience of performance.
It was so beautifully done. Thank you, Corbin. And Professor Belser, Julia, thank you so much for serving as our 13th annual CLGS Georgia Harkness lecturer. Really an honor and a privilege. Thank you for your work. And thank you everyone for being here either at this moment or in the recordings that you are watching at some future time and place and state. And again, thank you everyone. And thank you, Professor Belser. Really, it's been an honor.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Good night, folks. And some people, I think, good morning.